We are still in our outlining workshop, so still going through the essentials of figuring out everything that happens in your book before you actually start writing those pages and move ahead into the bootcamp portion of this class. Or of this course. So we are on we're not on a stage channel today. We've actually had to move to a voice channel, so you don't have to raise your hand. How about that? So I think we know about WordCamp and ScriptCamp by now, but if you're recently joining us, we are a writing community. That's part of our nonprofit that offers free and low-cost classes to learn new skills and reach your life goals. So ScriptCamp is our biggest server with about 5,000 members and plenty of classes happening on there all the time. You can see we have a bunch of upcoming free ones, including next week. We have a new one called Victory Lap, which is kind of on interesting twists on the third act. We have Writing Pilots on the 7th. That's our week 0 overview of the pilot course, and then week 1 is on the 13th, and both of those are free and open to everybody. Sundays, 10 to noon, the new session of Feature Bootcamp starts on the 14th. I think I'm hearing somebody is not muted. Please mute your mics. Thank you. All right, so the novel bootcamp gets going starting on the 8th, so we are finishing up the outlines with this week and next week being what we're calling Final Outline Lab. So that's where you will be invited to take us through your story and make sure everything's clicking and making sense, and then actually starting those pages on the 8th. Writing your novel in 90 days, you'll be writing about 2,000 words a day, for adult length at least. Less if you're writing shorter. And also that first class in Novel Bootcamp on the 15th, so we have week 0 and week 1 free on every bootcamp, open to everybody, the 15th on this same time slot, 12 to 2 on Saturday. Okay, so here's just all the recurring events that we have coming up and happening now. June 27th, UI design on CodeCamp and Discord bots on the 25th of July. We have multiple advanced labs. We have Weekly Writers Lab that meets Fridays 12 to 2, and also today from 4 to 6 to bring your questions, topics, and up to 5 pages of anything you're working on. All right, so plenty going on. Lots of free stuff happening. Lots of events for subscribers as well. You can get a class on its own at scriptcamp.net/classes, or if you want to sign up for unlimited membership, which includes access to everything in SkillCamp, not just ScriptCamp, but also WordCamp, all the novel classes, all the screenwriting classes, TV, all the game, AI, filmmaking, creator, animation, design, language learning, and coding classes you can possibly handle. It's an all-you-can-eat buffet. So sign up scriptcamp.net/membership, and you will get access to all those exclusive member channels, big discounts on consultations and proofreads, access to video library of hundreds and hundreds of previous events. So it's very worth signing up. Okay, let's move forward. We are on the 4th step of this kind of roadmap. We started with story, concept, and logline, just figuring out the very bare essentials of what we're trying to make. Who is this going to appeal to? What is my target word count? What is my genre? And basic things like that. We worked on Sketchbook, and we're still working on Sketchbook because you're never done with Sketchbook. It's really just an unsorted document or an unformatted document, which does not really have a template to it, but that is ultimately going to contain all of your notes, pre-writing, inspiration, research, and other just gathering of ideas in the early steps. You move from there into story beats, where I usually work out the first version of story beats in the sketchbook itself, but once it's ready to move to stand on its own and move to the next document, then you copy and paste it over and adjust it from there into its own Google Doc that I use at least, and you will be figuring out the spine of the story, so using the story beats to figure out what happens where, with the intention of figuring out essentially what's going to happen in every chapter. We then move ahead from plotting story beats into scene cards, so that's what we're looking at this week, expanding story beats to get more specific and to include more of that really vital data that every scene needs to have. So we're going to know who's the point of view for this chapter, what is the conflict for this chapter, or multiple conflicts, because if you're writing really long chapters, you're going to have more scenes per chapter, and so you're going to be trying to figure out what are those scenes, where do they take place, who is the main character, what are they trying to accomplish, what is the obstacle and complication, what is the result, and how do we transition to the next moment, and all those normal things that we're always doing in screenwriting and TV writing as well. But with the added complications of prose being things like the idea that we're not always really in a scene. We're sort of, sometimes we have to kind of float from moment to moment and transition using more advanced prose techniques than just simply saying exterior. It's not just like in a script. We can't always just start the next scene with exterior house day. You need to bring us to that next moment and convey the passage of time and things like this in a way that don't work quite the same in the world of screenwriting as they do in the world of novels. Okay, so let's dive in. We've got a bunch of topics for today. We'll look at logline to story beats, and we won't spend way too much on structure because I'd rather spend most of today on scenes and chapters, but we will look at how to essentially just like it's a reminder on how to take a really well-written logline and figure out where some of those essential story beats are going to fall. Even from just having a logline that's well formatted, you can sort of put those first few moments on the board and kind of adjust everything around those and connect the dots forward and backwards to reverse engineer what the entire story arc is going to look like. So that'll get you your first couple story beats, or at least the general direction where they should sort of be. We can then look at what is a scene and a card, and how much info should a scene card really contain. How much are we really accomplishing on a chapter-by-chapter basis, and how to pace scenes of different length. We'll be reading the entirety of Horns by Joe Hill, Chapter 4, not the entire book, but just the entirety of Chapter 4 of Horns by Joe Hill, which is about 800 words. Pretty short chapter. We will look at types of scenes, conflict scenes, scene and sequel, and things like that. Digression, floating between moments, so transitioning between moments in prose, chapter breakdowns, and then towards the end we will have open lab for questions on your outlines or problems that you're trying to solve in relation to your outlining and pre-writing for your book. Okay, that is the overview for today. Let's get going with the basics of logline to scenes and chapters. So we'll start with this idea of logline to story beats. So by now we are many weeks, or 4 or 5 weeks in, you probably have a pretty substantial outline at this point, or you should have a pretty substantial outline at this point if you're following with the milestones of the class. And the idea is that a well-formatted logline does a couple things for you. One, it's just going to be required for querying a lot of the time because almost every agent says insert logline on their query tracker page or on their query manager page, and you have to just have it ready to copy-paste into a bunch of different fields, right? So you just have to have that just to even play the game. It's the cost of admission. You need a logline. Almost every agent. Not every single one, but most of them. At least in the adult and YA space. When you're working with children's book, or I should say picture books, I don't think you always need a logline for picture books. Somebody who has written picture books before, let me know if that's true or not, though.
You need a theme.
Interesting.
Instead of the log line, because what you don't need is an outline, because the outline is as long as the picture book words.
Right.
But you need the I say theme, the reason for the book. You know, the lesson that's learned or the subject it covers, that kind of thing.
Okay.
The reason for it to exist.
Good to know. And yeah, and I think when you're in picture books as well, usually the query field just says, just put all the text, because usually they're less than 500 words. So let's say if it's less than 500, just put the full text of the book in the query. So yeah, you've got to have a logline in most cases, though, and that logline is going to look generally sort of like this. When inciting incident, an adjective protagonist must conflict before stakes. That's more of sort of oh, go ahead.
And can I just say, for middle grade, like with adult books, when you're writing fantasy, you can maybe sometimes get away with a bit longer of a logline, like depending on the agent. With middle grade, the logline is exactly like a movie logline. You have 3 seconds to impress them. You know, it's really got to be like 50 words or less, preferably less.
Right. And yeah, I think around 35 to me is like the sort of more... 50 is kind of
I would say, like 35, yeah.
And the big difference being with children's, you typically you don't have to, but you can include the character name, especially if that's kind of like part of the brand, because if that main character is sort of part of the selling point of the story. Like imagine if their name is in the title, then probably you would include the name of the character in the logline.
Yeah, because you're planning on a series.
Exactly. So the character becomes sort of like the centerpiece of the series. And when I say children's, by the way, that is referring to everything up into adult. Is so like picture, chapter, middle grade, and young adult are all children's, including
Young adult, yeah.
young adult books that are up to 18-year-old protagonists. That's still considered children's publishing. So don't think that children's books always means like for young, like chapter book age. So that can be it's a really wide category, at least in the U.S. So
and you should always put the age of the child protagonist in the log line.
Yeah,
that tells the publisher.
At least. In YA, I don't think I see it sometimes in YA. It's like 17
Jackson
or whatever. But
sorry, I am talking middle grade. Yeah, YA you can kind of be a bit more like a teenager or a young adult, but when you're talking middle grade,
right,
because that you're not supposed to say, oh, this is upper middle grade, this is lower middle grade. You just say it's middle grade. The age of the character tells the agent whether it's upper middle grade or lower middle grade or just plain middle grade.
Right.
So.
And the ages for that being, would you say it's about like 9 to 13? Is that about right?
I'd say a little bit older because kids read up. So if the youngest reader is 9, it's normally 9 to 11 or 9 to 12 or 8 to 11 or 8 to 12 depending. Youngest I've seen character in a really successful middle grade books that's been published has been 10. Usually it's 11, 12. You can go up to 14 as well, although that's pushing more into that teen category.
Mm-hmm.
You can get away with it, particularly if it's more of a more naive 14-year-old.
Right. Okay, good to know. Thank you, Becky. So the logline into the story beats, let's think about this. So it looks like when or after inciting incident, that's also called the catalyst. An adjective protagonist must conflict, or else before stakes. So if we start looking at that, you just can kind of break down a couple key things about your story. Inciting incident, that's catalyst, so we already know where that falls on the story beats. So our story beats, once again, are going to be intro, catalyst, triangle locks, break into 2, premise scenes, midpoint, escalation, all is lost, pit of despair, break into 3, finale, epilogue. And so if we wrote that all out, I'm not going to write it behind me or on the screen at the moment, but imagine that's all written up before you. You have catalyst. When blank happens, okay, just highlight that and drag it immediately over to where you have the catalyst beat in your story. And it should be just that one thing. Catalyst is not a series of things happening. It's not a whole chapter. It's just going to usually kind of be considered, it's like the end of a chapter is kind of like that one moment that acts as the catalyst. Sometimes in books, like the entire progression of the chapter you might consider to kind of comprise the catalyst, but in any case, when you're writing it in your pre-writing, it should be just one clear event occurring. So not a bunch of things. An adjective protagonist, you can click and drag that to just the top of your intro, because usually you're trying to express who they are at the beginning of the story, and it might express who they are in terms of the interesting or unique tactics they use, or who they a limitation they face, some unique quirk of their character, what makes them unique, something they're missing, something they've been denied, something that just informs how they go about the world, their general status and position in the world, and what they want. So you have to pick your adjective or two pretty carefully. You can't like stack up a bunch of adjectives, but in any case, this is who you're telling us the character is in the first act. So then we look at must conflict. That's going to be put that at the top of premise scenes, because that's going to be what your character immediately after the break into 2 realizes, this is what I have to do, this is how I'm going to go about it, and they might of course be getting in way over their head or trying something that they're definitely going to fail at or something like that, really regardless, but the premise scenes mean that that's when we're going to start having the main sort of fun that you've promised for that book. Imagining what's on the cover, what's on the back of the book, like imagining the advertising for the book. If they make up an ad in a magazine or something like that, what would be shown? Is it going to be a pirate without a shirt kissing a lady on the deck of a ship? Because that's like a really specific kind of audience that you're going for. And like type of action that we'd want to see in the middle. It's going to tell us there's going to be action, adventure, and also romance. So in the middle, and probably if there's a shirtless character on the cover, it's going to be one of those spicy erotic romances that you see in the bookstore or the grocery store, which make a lot of money, by the way. So if you can write those, you should. Anyway, so the cover and all those things are going to kind of just clarify what is the overall type of fun that we're supposed to have in the story, that we are being invited to have in the story, I guess I would phrase it. And then within that, you have to just deliver on that in the premise scenes. So you know the sort of thing that your character is doing. He must liberate his kingdom one battle at a time. Okay, that's on the cover of that book. That's going to be like a knight with a big sword standing on a heap of corpses on the battlefield, right? That's going to tell us that throughout the premise scenes of the story, your main character is using battle tactics and strategy and things like this to conquer the enemy armies and win the day. You can have other stuff happen in premise scenes as well, but that's like kind of the crux or the main thrust of the premise scenes. So you have to know what the appeal of your book is, what specifically the genre is, and who would read this kind of thing. If you should be a fan of your kind of thing that you are writing about, because then you know what the audience would want to see, because you are in that audience. You shouldn't write a genre that you don't like or that you don't understand. Before stakes, that's telling us essentially we're hinting at, because the all is lost moment is that moment where victory now seems impossible, or that they've already failed, it's one or the other, then the all is lost is kind of hinting what should be happening, or the stakes are hinting at what should be happening there. So if it's we have to defeat the enemy armies before our kingdom is destroyed, then you're going to highlight that and move the kingdom seems certain to be destroyed at the all is lost moment. And that could come from various sources, like that there are various things that could indicate with your story that the kingdom is sure to be destroyed, right? That could be the shattering of the magic amulet that maintains the force field around Kingsbridge. Or that could be the death of the mentor figure, as it often is. This is the knight that trained your hero, has now fallen in battle, and how could we possibly win without wise old Sir Gondolf? So you get the idea. You have to look at the specifics of your story to assess what specifically marks for the reader that victory should now feel impossible. You have to look at what your characters were banking on, what tactics they were using, what they had accomplished so far, and the relationships they built that led them to maybe on their current track towards victory, whether or not they were even doing well at the time. You could have your characters struggle and fail the entire book and then have an all is lost moment too. It doesn't indicate that they have to do well at any point, but I mean, it's going to be a pretty miserable slog of a book if they're just failing and suffering every step of the way. But then again, some famous books are just, I mean, read Blood Meridian or All Quiet on the Western Front and you'll be like, oh no, you can just do that, I guess. In any case, there's your kind of main beats on your logline and how to transpose them into story beats and to start. And from there, once you have those on the board, we have 4 things, or four really powerful scenes. Or I guess in terms of the conflict, it's not one scene, but it's like a type of scene or a bunch of different. It's like a couple different sequences that are suggested by just the basics of your logline. Once you have that on the board, you'll have your catalyst. You have generally the details of the character we need to establish in the first act. You have a couple sequences from Act 2, and you have the the worst moment that we're working up to. So you know, kind of the crashing defeat that makes it seem as if it's all going to fail. That's going to mark the kind of the late second act. So all is lost that transitions directly into Pit of Despair is working you up towards the break into 3. You don't have to have the break into 3 in the logline. Okay, so from just these 4 things, you get 4 really important benchmarks on the board. That from there you should be able to reverse engineer, work forward and backwards, and just kind of do what you can to fill out the rest of those beats and figure out the general order of events that they need to happen in. And then once you've completed your story beats, we will be moving forward into getting more specific, figuring out how many words per chapter, what are the scenes in that chapter, and how do we get more granular about the specific action. So let me stop for questions on this idea first before we move ahead more into scene cards.
Could you go over the copying and pasting things from your logline and where they fall again? Just one more time.
Yeah, sure. Maybe if I just illustrated it would be a little easier too. Apparently also Nacho says we have a lot of people watching on Twitter, which I don't think we normally have. Hi, tweeters.
Hi, Twitter.
Xers? Is that what you like to be called now? Watch, they'll be mad at me for saying that. So we're going to illustrate how you can use a logline to figure out your main couple story beats. Let me just do it behind me here. So here's our story beats. We have intro, catalyst, trying to lock. Some people call this debate. Break into 2 premise scenes. Midpoint, escalation, all is lost, Pit of Despair, break into 3, finale, epilogue. Okay, there's our beats, and now let's look at what does a well-formatted logline look like. I can make that a bit bigger as well. What's a logline? When inciting incidents, an adjective, protagonist, must conflict, or else stakes. Okay, I've formatted it weirdly now, haven't I? Okay, let me put that above the intro, actually. Okay, so let's start putting stuff on the board. So, for instance, I'm just going to make a bad logline here. When his father returns from the Great War, an anxious schoolboy must defeat his. Let's say his dad comes home. He's got PTSD, and now he's trying to murder the family. God, I just came up with a. I guess it's a dark war. It's a dark thriller, dark sort of historical thriller. Traumatized into violent psychopathy, an anxious schoolboy must escape the house and survive the onslaught. Okay, his dad's trying to kill the son after he's having a PTSD flashback from war. Let's figure out where all these different things would go. So when his father returns from the Great War, that's the catalyst. So we'll just highlight that. Put that down here. Traumatized into violent psychopathy. An anxious schoolboy, that's what we're going to establish in the intro. Must escape the house, that's going to tell us what we're doing at the top of premise scenes. So that's going to suggest several different sequences that are related to that core idea. And then the last thing is, or else stakes. So we said he has to survive the onslaught, so that means stakes are death. So that would mean all is lost. Let's just say boy recaptured, because that would seem like he's sure to be killed. He's sure to be killed. Often when you have escape type stories, then the all is lost moment is the main character gets recaptured and they get locked in the deepest, darkest part of the dungeon sort of thing. Okay, does that make sense how you can just take those couple beats and figure out the basics?
Yeah, super helpful.
Cool. Any questions from anyone on this? Questions besides why did I immediately jump to the darkest, most horrible possible story?
You sound just like me. All right, for kids, let's pick the most depressing kids thing I can do.
Yep.
Do you have another word for premise scenes? Because sometimes I get hung up on every scene as a premise scene. Is there another thing people call that part of Act 2?
Sure. Fun and games is pretty common.
Fun and games,
Yeah.
okay.
Go ahead, Becky.
I was just going to say, I put my log line in the chat, but it's 40 words, so it's still too long.
Okay.
If you get a chance.
Oh,
you don't have to look at it.
Yeah, let's take a look. All right. Can you read it?
Sure. When she releases the spirit of a necromancer from his orb prison, 11-year-old medium Maddie must learn the archaic art of alchemy to retrap him before he uses her ghost sister Zatha to bring himself back to life. Nice.
This is a pretty good way of condensing the story that you were working on and that you've pitched us a little bit, or you've gone over a little in the previous weeks. It's working quite well. I would say there's just one little thing with this. Let me read it back really quick. So, when she releases the spirit of a necromancer from his orb prison, 11-year-old medium Maddie must learn the ancient, or you said archaic. I would probably go with ancient just because I'm not sure if middle grade, well, not that it matters that much, but that word just feels like I wanted it to be ancient for some reason. The archaic art of alchemy to retrap him before he uses her ghost sister's aether to bring himself back to life. So the question I'm wondering is, did he kidnap the sister at some point? Did we miss that? Or, like, does he have to find her? Is the sister with the main character and he's after both of them? It's just that the specifics of the villain's plan, I'm having trouble seeing the milestones of it. Does that make sense?
Right, yeah. He gets the sister at the All Is Lost.
Oh, that's quite late then. But so is he chasing after her for most of the story?
So if you remember the first I don't know, when we went through the outline, break into two was her freeing him. She actually trusted him to the beginning. He taught her how to do it. And then she realised that he was evil.
Right, but it seems like what you've expressed here in the last part is actually quite a late. Is that a late development?
It's the midpoint is when she finds out what he wants.
And that's when he kidnaps the sister too?
No. They managed to escape. He kidnaps his sister at the Order's Lost just before the break into 3. And she realizes what she has to do.
Right. So I guess for the majority of the story, so it just seems like this is like you're kind of giving away a bit of Act 3 without telling us most of what we're doing. What's the conflict in Act 2 is my question.
So the first half of it is she's given the promise of being able to bring her sister back by doing some training with him. It's like the premise scenes. And then, but she's lying to people about what she's doing. And she's ignoring that voice in her head that says this isn't right. And then at the midpoint, she learns the true intention of Necromancer, that he never actually intended for her to bring her sister back. He was training her to basically be able to bring him back.
Okay. Then the issue to me is then your logline doesn't even express what's happening in the premise scenes. You're sort of giving us the overall impression of where it goes eventually, but you're not saying what happens up to the midpoint. So this would almost, to me, this seems like it would be kind of like when she starts taking classes in sinister magic from the necromancer that she freed from a prison. Blank and Blank discovers that he actually has darker intentions than she anticipated, and now must stop him. So, do you see what I mean?
Yeah. Obviously, I need to get the sister in there because that's the stakes.
Yeah. Are they both studying with the necromancer?
No, only her. She's keeping it secret from her ghost sister. She's because she knows her ghost sister wouldn't approve.
Oh, okay.
Like, she knows what she's doing is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
She's just too tempted by the promise of bringing her ghost sister back to life.
Okay. So maybe I would phrase this not so much as when she releases the spirit of the necromancer, but more something like when she starts taking lessons from a necromancer in how to revive her ghostly sister, and maybe take it from there. Just so you give us that more of, like, we want to know what's happening in the middle of the story.
Right.
So I think you have communicated what happens in your book well, but just not in such a way that we can picture the primary action, I guess. But then again, I'm not sure exactly how much that matters for what you're doing, because I know that you are in like more of a corporatized sort of system where maybe they have a specific format they want to use or something like that. But in any case, that would be my initial thought, is that normally we are trying to communicate what is happening. If your logline only tells us stuff after the midpoint, then we've missed the like 20 to 50% mark, which is so key for like hooking us. Like, that's what we're reading for. And so this is kind of like my teacher's evil story. It sounds like I'm discovering this nice genie guy that we've rescued, who's been teaching me magic. Actually, he's up to something sinister. Is that about right?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's one of those be careful what you wish for type things.
Okay. So then maybe if at the beginning I would frame this sort of tutorship or mentorship relationship between them, and then take it from there. So when she discovers that her secret magic mentor is actually a bad guy, she must blank and blank before he eats her sister's ghost or whatever it is.
Eat her sister's ghost, I like it.
Well, is he eating them, or what's he doing? You said uses her. No, I guess he's maybe using it for a spell or something, right?
Yeah, he's got a machine. I'm sort of mixing alchemy. Obviously, had a lot of bases in science. I'm mixing magic and science together. It kind of has more of a steampunk feel, which I know is Victorian, but these guys are immortal, so they've lived for a long time.
Right.
So yeah, it's a machine that he's built.
Okay. Well, hope that helps for now. I think this is well written and phrased, but just if you're trying to communicate the middle of the story, maybe think of centering and amplifying that mentorship
Yes. Thank
Cool.
you.
Thanks for sharing. Okay, any other questions on Logline to Story Beats? Let me check on the tweet squad as well. I actually am not seeing a Stream People chat on this one. Is there a Stream People on WordCamp now, chat?
It uses the one on ScriptCamp.
Oh, it does. Okay.
Mm-hmm. The same channel.
Good to know.
The people of the stream.
Yes, they lurk in the stream. Oh, sorry. I just realized the text was off-center. There we go. Okay, if it seems like we have no more questions on that, we'll move ahead into scenes and chapter stuff. So, what are scene cards? What are scenes? So a chapter and a scene is not exactly the same thing. A chapter is like a group of scenes within a book that has an overall narrative point and is usually going to be in a kind of, I was going to say bite-sized, but you can decide the size of your bite as you're writing it. You can decide, it's like a pacing mechanism for deciding how long you want the reader to be reading before they get a moment that they can stop and put the book down, take a break. And we have to build these pacing mechanisms in. Excuse me. We have to build these pacing mechanisms in because it's not like a movie or a show where it's it's expected to be sort of consumed in one sitting. I've gone all blurry. Why have I got the blurry disease? Come on. Refocus. Okay. Oh, there we go. So, in any case, you can decide if you want to have longer chapters. You might imagine that the average chapter length is about 4,000 words in adult, and it trends shorter in terms of thrillers or more fast-paced stories like that, action, adventure, and thrillers type stuff, horror. And it's going to trend longer in terms of things like epic length, or epic sci-fi, epic fantasy, historical, nonfiction, all usually have much longer chapters. Contemporary can go either way. We see lots of examples of both. Literary will usually have longer chapters, but it doesn't always. There are some examples of literary, because literary is always playing with the rules and the boundaries and moving the goalposts around and things like that. Ooh, so bright. So let me turn that down just there we go, perfect. So how many scenes are in a chapter? It's up to you. You could have one scene in a chapter, and the chapter that we're going to read today is really just one scene. You could have 5, you could have 10, you could have 20. You don't have to have chapters in your book at all. But if you don't, then you're choosing not to use that pacing mechanism and not to give the reader that early out or that easy way of determining, like, okay, here's how much I want to read for the day, and then stop. You're sort of telling them, well, you have to figure that out on your own. So there are some famous books that do not have traditional chapters, but it's a good idea, and I recommend using it, and it makes a really natural point to transition between points of view as well. So points of view, usually the convention nowadays is that each chapter will be from a single point of view that in Third Limited. And if you're writing multiple first-person narrators, then usually a chapter switch is going to be a good place to swap that, because having multiple I narrators within the same chapter can get really, really confusing. So especially if you have more than 2 of them, then we're probably in trouble. So recommend using chapters. Recommend also switching POVs at the chapter and sticking to one POV per chapter, unless you have a great reason not to. To switch POVs in the middle of a chapter is called head hopping, or I guess within the middle of a scene is usually considered head hopping. You can use a break, which is 3 asterisks or 3 pound signs, or actually I think 3 pound signs usually indicates the end of the whole manuscript. So I would do 3 asterisks. But that would be indicating when a break happens that could be chronological, so some time passes, or we could change points of view in that moment. It's really up to you how you want to manage that, but it's more common and a little easier for modern readers to follow just because we're so used to this. The idea that every chapter is from one solid point of view and stays in their head the whole time. You can even label the chapter from that point of view if you want. Think of like the Game of Thrones style that he made this really popular, which is just say, write the name of the character at the top of their chapter so there's no mistaking who this is about, whose head we're in. So you're really trying to balance your different points of view throughout in whatever way makes sense for your story. You can see on the right that I use highlighting to indicate where one point of view starts and the other one ends, and therefore you can just zoom out and use that color coding to determine who has the most page time and who doesn't have as much page time, and who you might need to bring forward or push back in whatever way. But since we're not dealing with actors, You don't have to worry about, is the main character going to be on screen enough that some actor's going to want to play this character? You don't have to worry about that. You can do whatever you want with any of these people. You can have an unlimited number of members of your cast. There's no budget considerations when it comes to a book, which, coming from screenwriting, that is the most liberating aspect of it to me. So the baseline for chapters we mentioned for adult is around 4,000 words, but you don't have to be that strict about those numbers. I would just use that as the expectation for adult, and it's going to skew about half that length for younger age groups. So YA and middle grade, 2,000 is kind of going to be like they're maxing out around 2,000, 2,500, unless there's like... Go ahead.
Like I say, middle grade is even less now, and I'm so gutted because my chapters are normally around 2,000 to maybe 2,500, and now I'm being told I need to make them 1,000 to 1,500 absolute tops.
Yep.
So it actually, on the shorter side, is much better for middle grade. Obviously, that's different for YA. And it's also different if you're going at the upper end of middle grade or you're writing specifically for the middle grade confident readers. But, that's a really small market. Yeah. They actually estimate it should be about 1,000 words for middle grade.
Good to know. Thank you for that. And in terms of in chapter books, it's also probably around the same. Go ahead.
I say chapter books, I think it's about 500 words, isn't it? Everything's getting shorter, basically, in kids' lit, so whatever number you were given, shorten it.
Yeah. Imagine they have a phone in their other hand as they're reading the book. So let's look at some types of scenes, and some of these slides are drawn from a slideshow that Becky, you yourself put together a while ago, so thank you for that. I'm not sure if this one is, but a few of the slides are. So we are looking at conflict scenes, sequel. So this is like scene/sequel. When we're referring to that concept, usually it's looking at conflict scene, then quote sequel to that scene, not a sequel to the book, but a sequel to the scene itself. We have discovery scenes as well, which might sort of raise questions or reveal information we didn't know before, but doesn't necessarily contain conflict. And then we're going to have what we might consider vignettes, or this kind of floating thing that we'll be talking about later, where we are connecting conflict scenes basically with passing of time and other things happening that are not directly in the hard data of scene work. Here's a question from Naomi in the chat. Do you differentiate between scenes and sequences? Yeah, so to me, a sequence is a group of scenes. So a sequence might, like for instance, the entire story is one long sequence, but an act is also a sequence. And within an act, you might have multiple sequences nested as well. For instance, we might have, the escape from prison sequence. And then you have and that might be like 3 scenes on its own. And we might have the getting to the nearest city sequence, which might be 5 or 10 scenes. It just depends on the structure and pacing of your book, what specifically those scenes are. But yeah, to me, a sequence is a group of scenes. Okay, so let's first look at what's a conflict scene. A scene is a unit of conflict, at least according to Mr. Dwight V. Swain in Techniques of the Selling Writer, which is a popular writing book. So it's an account of an effort to attain a goal despite opposition. Is just a really clinical, weird way to look at this. But someone wants something. They try to get it using tactics appropriate to their character. They struggle with obstacles in attempting to get that thing. They succeed or they fail. This changes something for the overarching story. We've usually progressed closer to or further from their larger goal. That's the essentials. So you're framing conflict scenes from one character's point of view at a time, usually because we are only in one character's point of view on a chapter by chapter basis. But you might have multiple scenes kind of covering the same events from different characters' points of view, in a way that you have a lot of freedom to do in books that you don't always have in movies and shows. It can be really jarring to constantly flashback or to go into other characters' perspectives on the same thing in a movie, but in a book, it's totally cool. You have a scene, then you play through it from 3 different people's points of view. It can work just fine. We like to frame, first of all, who's the main character? Usually that's your point of view character, but if you have some odd exception, like the kind of Nick Carraway Great Gatsby thing, where your main character is more of an observer, then maybe the main character of the scene is someone else that your main character is kind of following along and reporting on, but they are not directly trying to get something themselves. What do they want? What's in the way? We frame what the scene is about or what it seems to be about quite early on, so we sort of set up the premise for And often, if we're in our first chapter, our first few lines will sort of say, "This is the story of blank," but not always in those exact words, right? But we're setting up. This is what you're about to read. Hey, imagine somebody telling an anecdote. You'll never guess who I saw at the store the other day. No, who? Okay, I was driving to, and then you sort of set up the story. You hit the catalyst, and then you build from there. Like telling verbal stories works similarly. You start it out by framing the kind of experience that somebody's in for. You'll never guess who I saw. Oh, it's a mystery, I guess. It's a low-stakes mystery with probably not that much payoff. When people are, you'll really recognize when someone's bad at telling anecdotes and stories, much more so than when you notice somebody's really good at it. Because when somebody's bad at it, just think of like your various relatives at Thanksgiving and stuff like this. Everyone can tell when they're including extraneous information or they're going off on tangent after tangent after digression after digression. And then by the end, you're like, wait, but who did you see at the store? And they've like already forgotten that was the point of the story. So that can happen like when we drift too far away from this basic structure of frame what the scene seems to be about at the beginning or what it initially is about at the start. That's actually kind of important for staying on track and for returning to by the end. So you say, okay, and that was the story of blank. That's who I saw at the store today. So you want to build intrigue and ask a question early on in the scene. So once we have what your characters think to be their perception of events, or they think they know what they want, then we like to often introduce a sort of surprise, or a question of some kind of mystery that needs to be resolved, even if it's something small. Maybe the question is, well, I know what they want, but why are they going about it like that? I know our character, at the beginning, he was like, this chapter starts out with him going, I'm really hungry. Then he goes to a store and he's staring in the window. Whoa, somebody's honking their horn. I think, make sure your mics are muted, please. Is somebody on script camp on the middle of the highway, perhaps? Anyway, your character starts the scene saying, I'm really hungry. They go to a store. They're like, Then we cut to, in the next scene, they're coming in the store in a trench coat with a mustache. We're like, oh, why are they doing that, right? So you might, and obviously we know what we think they're doing. They're trying to sneak in. But you might reveal, for instance, they had some other weird plan that you were trying to misdirect us at the start or something along those lines. So in any case, building this intrigue and like the question that we're asking could be, well, why are they approaching it that way? Or how do they plan? How could that possibly work? How could that succeed? And then we're going to keep reading to answer that question and find out. You're going to use tactics and find the fun. So whatever it is that your character does as part of their personality and skill set, their limitations can be part of the quote tactics they use as well. So if the scene is just, I don't know, climb a hill, but your character has a really bad injury, then the tactic they use might be just, struggling really hard using a stick to help hoist themselves up the muddy incline. Like, it doesn't have to be a complicated or brilliant tactic. We're just asking what specific way are they going about trying to solve that problem. And ideally, it's something that works for their character and makes sense within the world, and given the tools that that person has access to, the development that they've been through so far. You want to surprise us. Around the midpoint, it's nice to have this kind of tipping point in the center of the scene where we have the reveal of some kind of new information or some kind of development of the plan or a complication that makes things harder. We thought we figured out the tactic that was going to work, but then it turns out that there's 20 more guards than we thought. We figured out how to fight one guard, but we show up and there's 20 guards. Okay, we're going to have to reevaluate and reassess our tactics. You want to get to the point. So after you hit that surprise, then pretty quickly afterwards, you're trying to get to the point and reveal what is the scene actually about. So that might contrast to what it initially seemed like it was about. For instance, the scene might have started out as, I'm hungry, I'd like a bite to eat. But by the midpoint, once the cops show up and your character is getting arrested, what it's really about might be asking a question like, how far is the character willing to go to really survive? Or something like that, right? So you want to explore that, hit a strong end note, and get out early. We want to get into scenes late and get out of scenes early, meaning that you are going to start the scene as late as you can, meaning we want to cut off a lot of the introduction, the showing up, the hi, how are you? You can usually cut to the middle of an interaction if you need to. Or you can summarize the first parts of it. You don't have to cut past it the same way you would in a movie, but you can just say, he showed up at the party and greeted everybody there and said his hi, how are yous and made chit chat all night. Then the scene starts at the end of the party. You can summarize a lot in just a couple of sentences in a book, and you can use that to kind of skip ahead to the most interesting parts. Even of a conversation, you can say they talked about this and that for a while, and then they settled on this topic. So you can give the impression of a conversation without having to write out every line in it, which is a really cool thing you can do in books, this idea of narrative summary. So you want to hit that strong end note. We want to get out early, clarify what has changed, if anything. Did nothing change and the main characters getting more frustrated or something like that? Did the main characters succeed or fail at their plan or their objective? What is the emotional impact on them? And then transition to that next moment. Those are kind of the basic building blocks of the scenes. Before we go any further into reading the scene that we're going to read today, let's ask, what questions do you guys have?
I guess we could talk more about setups and payoffs. Sort of, what's the difference between a setup, a clue, or just a detail, and how do you kind of show that on the page?
Okay, setups, clues, and details. So let's just start with setups. So a setup is going to be a plot element, a question, a piece of information that you tag that is going to have another piece of story info or data that corresponds to that later, that calls back to that, and that relies on that early setup. So this is going to be everything from, in your horror story, you have the character making dinner early on and they leave the butcher knife on the counter because the phone rings. And we have a lingering description of the knife where it rests on the counter in easy reach, glinting in the light of the lamp or whatever. You just kind of spend a couple extra words on it to indicate, maybe that's important. So I would say number of words you spend on something almost always is a key indicator to how important it will be in a book. And if suddenly you're spending 5 sentences on just describing the knife lying there, then we can tell that's not just scene setting after a certain point. Go ahead.
Sorry, that was to my husband because I was trying to transfer to my iPad and it turned the mic on. Sorry.
Oh, it's all good. Okay. Are you with me so far, Luke?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, number of words and just the way that you talk about something tells us what's important versus what's not. Things that aren't that important, you don't spend that many words on. Things that are more important, you do. And if we start to see this contrast between, well, that doesn't seem like it should be important, why are they telling me that it is? That can be a really key indication that this is a setup for something, as opposed to just, that's a thing in the world.
Okay.
So that's one of the key indications we have. You can also, if you're trying to deliberately do the opposite of that and trying to downplay how important something seems, and we would see this sometimes in detective and mystery type stories especially, if you want to bury a clue and then refer back to it later and say, oh, but remember, there was a setup there, it was really subtle, but you should have remembered that that one thing that we saw. Like Encyclopedia Brown was always doing this kind of thing, where we kind of deliberately do the opposite of this so as to obfuscate what's important. So that's just another variation on that idea. You can hide how important something is if you just mention it quite briefly, but then you run the risk of your reader saying, that isn't fair. You didn't tell me that was important enough, so how could I have known to focus on that? Go ahead.
In Encyclopedia Brown stories, are the clues sort of hidden in the in a list? Are there lists of?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sometimes.
So describing a room, you could sort of list the items in the room and bury a clue, or you could sort of list the items in the room, but then linger on the glinting knife on the countertop or whatever.
You can do both, and that there are very different types of technique, because in Encyclopedia Brown, it has that game element where it's the reader knows the rules, and we know that we actually have to sort of hyper-focus on every time that they do something like that because we're looking to solve the central mystery. But if you were trying to not play that game with the audience and you're just trying to tell them what's important, then yeah, you would actually need to go out of your way to use the words to amplify or emphasize something.
Okay.
So that's just some thoughts on that idea. What is the Encyclopedia Brown one I'm thinking of is there's it takes place at a bowling alley, I seem to remember. An encyclopedia gets a case from a kid that has dyslexia or some reading difference that makes him always switch the first letters of words around, and people are always making fun of him for that. And at one point he says, I was beaten up by this bully that had a shirt that said bowler pairs on it. And Encyclopedia is bowler pairs, that makes sense for a bowling alley. So he looks around, he checks all the shirts, but they can't find who the bully was. And it's I saw a guy that had this shirt on it, I saw a guy that said polar bears on his shirt, I saw a guy that said this, but I couldn't find the bully the kid was talking about. And then at the end it's can you solve this one? It's oh, it was the guy that said polar bears on his shirt, because that's who the kid was actually referring to, because he switches the first letters of words. So you see how we buried that in a list so as to make it harder to find on purpose. Maybe that was a convoluted example.
It's a little convoluted, but I followed it. It's a good example. And another kid detective that I forgot about that can go back in my list.
I used to read Encyclopedia Brown all the time. They're a good example of like anthology with a game kind of attached to it. It's like not quite choose your own adventure book style game, but pretty close to that sort of like engagement that it's asking for from the reader, in that you could like look in the back and they had the answers. It's like a it's like almost an interactive genre of little detective story. They were good.
I remember them being good, but I couldn't tell you what was in them. You remember way more about them than I do. I have to revisit it.
They're pretty low stakes mysteries for the most part. It's like, who stole the cake? Or like,
right.
It's not like solving triple homicides.
Right. I mean, he's a kid detective. Those stories are very low stakes. Yeah.
He's solving them for a quarter, I think, for the most part. Okay, so hopefully that gives you some thoughts on clues and setups and how to choose how many words you're using on something, so as to flag it as important for the audience. It's like more words you spend on something is the equivalent of holding the camera on something in a movie. If the camera just lingers on something and slowly zooms in on it for a long time, that's telling us that something important is happening there, and we don't have to know what it is yet.
No, that's helpful.
Thanks for the question. Any other questions on writing scenes before we read a scene?
So, how many times do you know how many words to put and how many times to repeat the setup? Like, is there like a general rule of thumb? You know,
Sorry, what do you mean repeating the setup? Why would you repeat the
like
setup?
let's say you have something in like 75% of the thing, and it's kind of a climactic moment, and it has like two objects in it, right? And you sort of want to do a foreshadowing, but like where do you put it? Do you put like how many words do you want to mention it? You want to be subtle, but you also want the person to get it. Like, what exactly is this? You know, kind of like how many like what exactly is the kind of mechanics around it?
I'm having trouble parsing your question
Awesome.
exactly. So you're talking about the like reveals, or are you talking?
Yeah,
talking
kind
about
of like a
mystery? Go ahead.
review. Like you have two objects in your big climactic moment. You know, your fixed point in time, fixed point in space. It's a pretty intrinsic moment. There are two core objects you have in it that needs to be set up. And so you sort of want to set it up early, but you also want to have it wait. And so you kind of want to remind or like a transponder where echoes the like let's say you have something in chapter one and you kind of echo it so that the reader kind of is reminded of it. Oh, this was all the way back in like chapter two, you know, stuff like
Okay,
that.
so you're sort of asking about twists and reveals.
Yeah, sort of
Okay.
like that.
So the objective is really for the information that you're hiding to be in plain sight the entire time, and to always be sort of right in front of us, and that we just never put things together until the information in the last couple scenes, or it doesn't have to be the scenes. You can unveil your twist wherever, which is why it's kind of hard to answer this question. But I will say, if you're trying to have a big impactful reveal later on, then you do have to kind of have. You can use. There's a bunch of ways you can do it. You can use red herrings to kind of divert from the information or give your characters false leads where they think they know the answer, but it's actually taking them the wrong direction. But then when we finally return to what the answer is, it has to all add up and make sense. So it's kind of tricky. There's not one solution or one template for how to do reveals and twists. But I would say the more that you can have the stuff that you're trying to hide on screen and right in front of us, and that we just can't quite put it together yet, or we don't know the implications of it, or something like that. Let's say you have a character that's secretly evil, but is going to reveal himself to be evil at the end. Throughout the whole story, it would work well for you to have a lot of scenes where he shows up out of nowhere and is like, "Sorry guys, I was in the bathroom," or something like that, and then we later find out that he did something the villain has been doing something just off screen the whole time, and every time that this character's been missing, we're going to start to be able to piece together, oh wait a minute, I've never seen them and the bad guy in the same room at the same time, but it's been right in front of us. So And think of like the Sixth Sense twist, that sort of thing, where the main character's status big spoilers for the Sixth Sense, the main character being a ghost for the whole story is right in front of us. It's not actually, and when you rewatch it knowing that, then you see all those obvious moments where that was actually kind of right in our face. And so the answer is kind of as much as you can to have that info be presented straight up to the audience, and just have them, if they're just missing like one key clue that ties everything together, that moment where they find that key clue becomes so satisfying, because they'll be like, I should have seen it. I definitely should have seen that coming. So it's tricky to find exactly how to play this, but like when you go into beta reading, it will become easiest for you to determine what you've given away too early and what you have not given enough clues for. But it really does come down to pretty much needing a reader to assess that for you, because it's so hard when we're just in our own head to determine how much information is enough. Anyway, I hope that helps a little bit. I realize that's not a definitive answer to that question because it's a toughie. But my overall advice is, instead of hiding your mystery element from off screen, you want to have it on screen as much as you can, just missing those little key clues that will make everything sort of feel like it comes together eventually. And then your reader will look back at all those obvious moments they should have seen it coming, and that's how you can sort of determine how well you've done with the big reveal later on. Thanks for the question. Yeah, beta read is always going to be, when it comes to tricky questions about reveal of information and things like this, almost always you need to have an outside perspective on it. Okay, shall we read a scene? It's a short chapter from Horns by Joe Hill. This is a dark fantasy book, 104,000 words long, from I want to say 2012 is when it came out. Let's remember the basic elements of conflict scene. X character is trying to solve X problem using X tactic. The obstacle is blank, forcing our character to blank, and the result is blank. So at the end, we're going to ask those questions again. We're going to make a scene card for this scene. Blank character is trying to blank using blank tactic. The obstacle is blank, forcing the character to blank. Okay, background. So this chapter is 800 words. We're in the first act. We're in Trying the Locks, and it's a conflict scene. The setup is Ig, as he goes by, Ignatius Parrish, has woken up with a set of horns growing out of his head. He doesn't know why. Now people have started telling him dark secrets and asking permission to give in to their sinister urges. Whenever he touches someone, he can see their unsettling secrets. He goes to the doctor for help. That's all we really know so far. And ultimately, the premise of this book is that he's going to use this weird new power to solve a mystery. So it's one of my favorite books. Here's a screen grab from the movie from 2014, I think, which was not very good. But the book is just so well done. So I'm going to read, and at the end I will go back to these questions and we will make this scene card. Remember, what is the character trying to do using what tactic and things like this. We'll also ask a question about how is this fulfilling the structural function of Trying the Locks / that debate portion of the story. You don't need to know the whole plot to answer this question. Okay, now that you have a preview of what the questions will be, let's go back and read the chapter. Okay. The nurse who took Ig's weight and blood pressure told him her ex-husband was dating a girl who drove a sporty yellow Saab. So this is the brief aside. This is the start. This is not the middle of the chapter. This is how it starts. We've started in the middle of his examination at the doctor. The nurse knew where she was parked and wanted to go over on her lunch break and put a big long scratch in the side with her car keys. She wanted to leave dog shit on the driver's seat. Ig sat perfectly still on the exam table, his hands balled into fists, and offered no opinion. So remember, people are just telling him their secrets and he can't get them to stop. He does not know why they're doing this. When the nurse removed the blood pressure cuff, her fingers brushed his bare arm, and Ig knew that she had vandalized other people's cars many times before. A teacher who'd flunked her for cheating on a test, a friend who'd blabbed a secret, her ex-husband's lawyer for being her ex-husband's lawyer. Ig could see her in his head at the age of 12 dragging a nail along the side of her father's black Oldsmobile, gouging an ugly white line that ran the length of his car. The exam room was too cold, air conditioning blasting, and Ig was trembling from the chill and his nervousness by the time Dr. Reynolds entered the room. Ig lowered his head to show him the horns. He told the doctor he couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. He said he thought he was having delusions. People keep telling me things, Ig said. Awful things. telling me what the things they want to do, things no one would ever admit to wanting to do. A little girl just told me she wanted to burn her mother in bed. Your nurse just told me she wants to ruin some poor girl's car. I'm scared. I don't know what's happening to me. The doctor studied the horns. Worry lines furrowed across his brow. Those are horns, he said. I know they're horns. Dr. Reynolds shook his head. They look inflamed at the points. Do they hurt? Like hell. Ha, said the doctor. He rubbed a hand across his mouth. Let me measure them. He ran a tape around the circumference at the base, then measured from temple to point and tip to tip. He scratched some numbers in his prescription pad. He ran his calloused fingertips over them, feeling them, his face attentive, considering, and Ig knew something he didn't want to know. He knew that Dr. Reynolds had a few days before stood in the dark of his bedroom, peering around a curtain and at his bedroom window. Oh gosh, I forgot about this part. Masturbating while he watched his 17-year-old daughter's friends cavorting in the swimming pool. God, I had to pull this really messed up scene for a public class, didn't I? The doctor stepped back again, his old gray eyes worried. He seemed to be coming to a decision. You know what I want to do? What? Ig asked. I want to grind up some OxyContin and have a little snort. I promised myself I'd never snort any at work because I think it makes me stupid, but I don't know if I can wait 6 more hours. It took Ig another moment before he realized the doctor was waiting for his thoughts on the matter. Can we just talk about these things in my head? Ig said. The doctor's shoulders sank. He turned his face away and let out a slow, seething breath. Listen, Ig said. Please, I need help. Somebody has to help me. Dr. Reynolds reluctantly looked up at him. Ig said, I don't know if this is happening or not. I think I'm going crazy. How come people don't react more when they see the horns? If I saw someone with horns, I'd piss down my own leg, which in fact was exactly what he had done when he first... They're hard to remember, the doctor said. As soon as I look away from you, I forget you have them. I don't know why. But you see them now. Dr. Reynolds nodded. And you've never seen anything like them? Are you sure I can't have a little sniff of Oxy? The doctor asked. He brightened. I'd share. We could get fucked up together. Ig shook his head. Listen, please. The doctor made an ugly face, but nodded. How come you aren't calling other doctors in here? How come you aren't taking this more seriously? To be honest, Reynolds said, it's a little hard to concentrate on your problem. I keep thinking about the pills in my briefcase and this girl my daughter hangs out with, Nancy Hughes. God, I want her ass. I feel sick when I think about it. She's still in braces. Please, Ig said. I'm asking for your medical opinion, your help. What do I do? Fucking patience, the doctor said. All any of you care about is yourselves. All right. I see Becky asked in the chat, is this age appropriate? I don't know. What age are you? So, yeah. Clearly I should maybe just double, triple check the scenes before public classes, but there we go. Horror novels, dark fantasy, gross stuff in these sometimes. Let's go to our questions. So we're going to spell out the conflict and make the scene card. So who is our character? Whose point of view are we in?
It's so easy. Come on, guys. It's Ig.
Thank you. Yes, it's Ig's point of view. How do we know?
Well, I mean, it's telling us it's his point of view. Like, it's showing his internal thoughts and things, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, things that only he could see or perceive. Okay. What problem is he trying to solve?
He's trying to figure out the horns. The horns is the problem he's trying to solve.
Yeah, he wants to figure out why they're there and get rid of them.
And also the weird behavior of everyone suddenly because of these horns.
Mm-hmm. And what tactic is he trying to use?
He going to the doctor, getting checked out, getting a medical opinion.
Pretty big. It's not a complicated or unique tactic. It's what any of us would pretty much do. You would go and ask questions at the doctor and be a patient. You know, we're not at the point in the story where he's trying anything extreme yet. We're still in the first act. What's the obstacle?
The people around him, the nurse, the doctor.
But what's the
and
problem?
I guess they keep telling him their secrets and asking permission to do things, and he doesn't know why.
Yeah, that's linked to the problem. I would say the obstacle mostly is that they're not addressing the horns, or they don't seem to think they're strange or even an issue, right? So he's trying to get rid of the horns. The problem is they aren't helping him.
Yeah, they can't even see them half the time. They forget that they're there.
Yeah, they just don't think they're noteworthy. It's the strange thing. And then forcing our character to do what? How does he get pushed emotionally in this sequence?
I don't know. How does it end? How does he have a breaking point in this scene?
No, this is the whole chapter.
That's the whole chapter.
He's really forced to beg.
So
He's like, "Can we get another
Okay.
doctor? Like, can we get somebody else?" Like he's starts asking reasonable questions, and by the end, he's pleading. And the result is what? Does the problem get fixed?
no.
No. Not only does it not get fixed, it's worse than we thought it was before. Okay, so I think we can see a pretty clear scene cut here. Let me just stick with Luke because you're already speaking. Did you feel this was short, medium, or long? Could you read this in one sitting?
Short, definitely one sitting.
Yeah, I guess I just did, so that answers that question. How specifically, here's a trickier one, but I think you can get this one. How is this fulfilling the structural function of trying the locks debate late first act?
Well, he's trying the obvious tactic
Yes.
initially.
Can you explain?
Hold on, give me just 1 second, and then I'll explain.
Okay. Luke goes off and does a bunch of push-ups. Okay, he's ready.
Sorry, no. Okay. Yeah, that would be funny though. All right, what was the question? I'm sorry.
So the idea of, in trying the locks, your character's trying the normal solutions that anyone would try, right?
Oh, yeah, trying the locks. So his tactic is, try the obvious solution first, and it doesn't work. So has to resort to, you said, pleading, begging.
Yeah. So, and why do we do that in trying the locks?
Why do we try the obvious thing first? So because it sort of rules it out. It gives us a good three body problem does a lot of this, like explaining why we can't do all of these sort of ordinary things and why we have to do these sort of like extraordinary things.
Yeah. Because stories are about people doing extraordinary stuff.
Exactly.
Not ordinary stuff. And if they could solve the problem using the ordinary methods, then it wouldn't even be a story. So it's best to get that out of the way early and to sort of answer the question for the audience, well, why didn't they go to the cops? Well, why didn't they get their parents to fix the issue? The trying the locks is essential for resolving this question. Think of something like Stranger Things, right? The kids take in 11. Well, why don't they just take her to their parents and go to the police? Oh, because 11 warns them there's bad adults looking for me, and if you try to take me to the adults, I'll leave, and you'll all be in huge danger. So early on, you have the characters sort of entertain the idea of approaching this in the standard way, and then we have a clear, demonstrated reason why they can't actually do that, which forces them up into the we're moving them up into the break into two, which is where they realize I have to try something else. I have to go beyond the normal, average, everyday, ordinary methods to solve this problem. Thanks for the good answers, sir.
Okay. You're welcome.
I'm seeing a comment from Mario as well. It's the no and furthermore in a try-fail cycle. Yeah, the no and. Does he get an explanation for his malady? No. And furthermore, the doctor's now asking him for advice. Yeah, exactly. He's realizing not only can this doctor not help me, no one can help me. No medical professional can help me. They're all just going to do this. Let's talk scene sequel. So, in addition to defining a scene usually being this more conflict-based unit of narrative, we have what you might consider to be the, quote, sequel to that scene. And that's kind of where your characters are reflecting on new developments and processing them and planning on what to do next. So, when your character acts on that decision, that's going to lead us to that next scene. So these are kind of like these interstitial scenes that exist between these major moments of conflict, where your character, you can't, especially if we're an action-focused story, you can't just do constant action or else it's not going to be clear how it's affecting the character as we go, how it's affecting their personality, their moral position, their view of themselves, their view of their role in the world, all these things that we kind of have the ability and responsibility to do in a book in order to keep track of your character's mental state. So sequel scenes are fantastic for tracking the character's mental state and the progression of their arcs in between moments of action. Digression. Some authors like to go on tangents, or have their characters go on tangents, and those can be part of the best part of these books. Think of your Douglas Adams or your David Foster Wallace or people like this. At times we divert from the action of a scene, or we might spend some extra time floating or speaking at length about a topic when we don't necessarily need to. I recommend, if you're on the fence about this, you generally want to not include digressions and just stick with the plot for the most part. In commercial fiction, if you're writing literary, you might have a lot more license to sort of explore other ideas or themes that the events of the story remind you of, or stuff like that, historical connotations, connections in terms of technological development, or things like this. I would just try to make sure that these are creating the desired emotional effect in the reader and connecting to the themes of the work. So and ideally it's something that you can use these kind of digressions as sneaky setups for later too. If early on your characters, they, at the crime scene, the cop sees that there's a couple triangles carved into the dirt with a stick, you're like, oh, that's kind of like cuneiform. That's funny. That was my major in college. I took a class on ancient Babylonian scriptures. That's so weird. And then they go on about how they work for a little bit. Then way later in the story, we run into another cuneiform tablet that the killer has left at a different crime scene. Then actually that digression wasn't a digression at all. It just seemed like it was at first. So you can use that to like sneakily hide exposition or setups or foreshadowing or things like that. Or if not, then I would just make sure that digressions are connected to the main idea of why you're writing the book in the first place. What are those central sort of dramatic or thematic questions that permeate the entire thing? When you read something like Snow Crash, you will get to it's a cyberpunk sci-fi action-ish kind of story. It's not exactly action, but there's action scenes in it. And sometimes when the characters are looking into solving the main mystery, there will be about a 2-page digression about ancient Sumeria or something like this, right? Like the way that this is maybe why I was thinking cuneiform, because they were talking about these parallels between binary code and cuneiform, and how the remnants of Babylonian civilization is left over in essentially megabytes of data that has been like poked into clay. And so that's like an interesting way of exploring this idea of like how information and computing and literacy and all these things kind of weave together in the grand human experience, and like all these central questions that the book is attempting to explore. So within a book you have more space to do those things. It should make sense in your point of view. So your main character should be someone that could go on digressions about those things. Or if you're in an omniscient point of view, then you have the ability to you yourself be kind of the chronicler or the journalist that's diving into this fictional world and can go on these digressions as well. In any case, a really good digression won't feel that much like a digression, because it will feel so woven with the main fabric of the story, and we'll see the role that it serves, and it's creating a specific effect. It's not just existing for information alone. It's tough to figure out how to do that, though. So basically, don't go on for chapters and chapters. Floating, I do want to look at it's not a whole scene, we're just going to look at a paragraph from another book on how I've really enjoyed seeing this done lately. But think of how a scene in a book is different from a scene in a movie, a play, or a TV show, because in visual media, we are always in a scene, except during some exceptions in plays. In a book, we are often doing something I call floating until the author deliberately kind of settles and grounds us into a scene. So this is kind of how we bridge time between the major scenes. There can be setup before a scene, digressions within that scene, and reflection afterwards, and then we might occasionally have to, or we will often, not always, sometimes you can just end a scene and pick right up as another scene starts, but we might be kind of trying to summarize the passage of time, give the feeling of what has changed within the passage between these scenes. Maybe we want to reflect on how culture or society have changed in the meantime, or something like that, depending on how long actually it is that has gone by. If we're not reflecting on years going by, then you might just simply, your character spends the day in Munich or something like that, right? So we might give a couple anecdotes of them at the cafe, and then strolling the chestnut-lined boulevards, then they're in the park, then they're at the movie theater, whatever it is. And all of those anecdotes altogether don't really have a central conflict to them, but they are us kind of drifting to that next moment that we will settle into and find character, objective, tactic, and all those basic kind of dramatic units. So let's look at an example of floating from, this is the opening page of Half a King by Joe Abercrombie, which we read from 2 weeks ago. Or 1 week? 2 weeks? I think it was 2. Let's look at how we kind of crane down the equivalent In a movie, imagine this crane shot where we start high and we kind of float down and we settle on something happening. Let's look at how this is done, and I'll give you a preview of the questions we'll be asking yet again. We're going to be filling out these questions. What is the premise of the chapter? So that first line usually tells us what the whole chapter and what the whole book is kind of going to be about. What is the hook, as in what is the first thing that it can be a reveal or a question or something like that that keeps us reading? Whose point of view are we in? What do we learn about the setting, the tone and atmosphere, the characters, and the world-building details, all in about one paragraph. Okay, so there's your preview. Let's read. There was a harsh gale blowing on the night Yarvi learned he was a king, or half a king at least. A seeking wind, the Getlanders called it, for it found every chink and keyhole, moaning Mother Sea's dead chill into every dwelling, no matter how high the fires were banked or how close the folk were huddled. It tore at the shutters in the narrow windows of Mother Gundring's chambers and rattled even the iron-bound door in its frame. It taunted the flames in the fire pit, and they spat and crackled in their anger, casting clawing shadows from the hanging herbs, throwing flickering light upon the root that Mother Gundring held up in her knobbled fingers. And this? It looked nothing so much as a clod of dirt, but Yarvi had learned better. Blacktongue root. So do you notice how we started up high in the sky, and we craned down and down and down until we sort of very naturally transitioned into the middle of a scene that was already in progress? Okay, let's answer the questions. Who wants to fill these out with me?
Can we get another volunteer?
Who among you shall volunteer? Is there no one to challenge me? Hashtag Bonesaw from Spider-Man 1.
I can have a go.
Okay, thank you, Becky. So, let's start with our first couple questions. Premise and hook.
Learned he was a king, or half a king at least. So we know that it's going to be, wouldn't necessarily say straight away I'd know it's fantasy, although I kind of feel it would be with the half a king at least a bit. But yeah, it's that kind of, we know it's going to be some kind of epic battle, as in not necessarily a physical battle, but like for the fight for the throne, because it's never that easy, is it, for someone who's entitled to be king to actually take the throne.
Yeah, it's also unusual to say somebody learned he was king, right? Because normally you would know.
Yes.
And you'd be working for years to make that happen, or you would, you would inherit it from your ailing parent or something. You would know you were going to be king. The night he learned he was a king is the premise of this chapter. It's like the anecdote. You'll never guess who I ran into at the store is the premise of that story. The premise of this story is, let me tell you about the night that Yarvi became king. And then the hook becomes half a king. What does that mean? We don't know yet. So we're going to keep reading to find out. So whose point of view are we in?
We're in Yarvi's point of view.
Yep. How do you know?
Well, the half a king at least feels like we're in his head anyway. But also the things like, the wind found every chink and keyhole, that kind of, he's feeling it. He's feeling the cold. As we get closer, we can see the things that he can see. What was it? It was something about the door.
At the very end here, I feel like this could be either Mother Gundring or Yarvi's point of view until the end. Because at the end, it looked like nothing so much as a clod of dirt, but Yarvi had learned better. That is in his head.
Yeah.
Up until then, though, you're right that it has to be one of the two of them, because it's describing a scene that only they are in. But then, by the point, it sort of clarifies at the conclusion of this passage here. So anytime you're mentioning something that's happening purely in a character's mind, then we are either in that character's point of view, or we are in the point of view of another character that's speculating as to that character's mental state. Okay, how about the setting?
So yeah, this is what I was saying, is that to begin with, You've got, learned he was a king. So at that point, it could either be fantasy or historical. You'd go fantasy because of the name Yarby, but that's only me thinking. I know history, and if you weren't sure, it could be like, the old historical of the old kings of, Europe type thing. So, I think for me, it's the way that it describes, like with the wind, the fact is every dwelling, although it still could be historical.
Yeah, nothing. So in terms of the setting, we don't know too many specifics yet. Though we don't have any place names, for instance, except for the Getlanders. So we know about that must be a ethnic group or a culture in this world.
We know he's not in a castle or something like that you would expect a king or a future king to be in.
Good point. It doesn't feel really cozy or wealthy, does it? It feels kind of like
no,
ragged and threadbare.
Yeah, like into every dwelling, the folk huddled.
Iron-bound doors are also. We don't. Most modern houses do not have iron-bound doors, so that kind of builds that kind of Dark Ages feel to it, I think, as well. It sort of tells us the world that we're in.
Yeah, I would still argue that at this point, I mean, it's the language, I think, that would say it's fantasy rather than historical. I can't pinpoint exactly why it feels fantasy and not historical.
Yeah, good question. Maybe there's some really subtle nuances there. Let's ask the question of tone and atmosphere.
So yeah, it's the wind. It's that thing, isn't it? It was a dark and stormy night. Like it's always a kind of stormy weather when bad news comes. So it's a description of the wind, like almost attacking the dwellings, and that people can't get warmth. Adds to that kind of poverty nature of where he is.
Yeah, it's kind of a dark, desperate world. The tone right off the bat is not happy or cozy. It's more sort of like building this picture of the world where people are struggling for survival against the elements, and this is going to be a story about harsh survival.
Yeah.
If it had started with, the same sort of setup, but instead of the wind finding its way to chill the people no matter how closely they huddle, that feels very dark and desperate, right? But if it started out with, Yarby was comfortable kicking up his feet by the fire in his nice castle. He had servants bringing him trays of steaming entrees, which the smell of buttered scones and all that kind of stuff. You could build like a really different picture of the kind of experience that the story was going to be about.
Even if he didn't know he was king, but he was in a cozy cottage by the seaside with his fellow people in this nice little village, and because that's a different story. I mean, that is a story. Think about the Hobbit that has to leave his perfect little corner of paradise to go and confront the world.
Right.
But it's kind of that the difference between the normal world. It could be really nice. In this case, it's not. I would also say I was very interested by the word iron-bound door in its frame, because normally you associate with irons when you're talking about historical or fantastical as some kind of you put him in irons, like caption. You said that this, when you read the blurb at the back of the book the other day, it mentioned about potential imprisonment later on. So
yeah, that's the catalyst as he gets enslaved. So there you go. In terms of casting people in iron. So characters, we have 2 characters. Any idea as to the dynamic between them?
Um, They seem to be. I don't know. I thought they were kind of friends. Maybe they know each other.
Yep, they definitely know each other. With a name like Mother Gundring, it sort of gives the impression she's older, maybe kind of a mentor kind of role to him.
Yeah, she sounds like one of those, like, all the villagers have the witch doctors, the kindly old lady that makes sure everyone's like safe in the village, that everyone looks up to type role.
Yeah, and what's the first interaction we see? She holds up the root and goes, "And this?" And he identifies it correctly, black tongue root. So we're actually in the middle of her quizzing him about stuff.
Yes.
So to that end, we get the idea the dynamic might be this is his teacher and he's trying to impress her or pass the test. He's trying to, follow his lessons. And last, we have world-building details. So we've kind of been touching on these all throughout, but let's just kind of highlight a couple things. First of all, what does it tell you that we use this term Mother Sea?
I mean, it's capitalized, so it's a noun.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of world building, if we refer to...
Oh, they're by the beach.
Yep. So the fact that they call the ocean this, though, what does that tell us about their culture?
That it's kind of like Mother Nature, but it's like Mother Sea. They worship the sea, or they live by the sea. The sea's important to them.
Yeah, they personify it enough to have a name for it, and like a motherly name tells us that they rely on it, and that this is like a religious concept in their world. The sea is like kind of a god to them. We see more of that in the rest of the book, obviously. There's just a little hint to it here. But you can see how even just dropping a world-building concept without explaining it can build out a picture of the world while also dropping little mysteries or little questions to keep reading for. Because we're so early on, we don't even know what the setting is. We don't know much about this culture. So we sort of learn about it piece by piece in a way that's kind of layered into the scenes. We also later learn they believe that God has died and been broken and shattered his corpse all over the world and stuff like that, which we kind of come to believe are like maybe spaceships, perhaps. They think that they're like ancient elven structures. I think they're spaceships, though.
Right. Yeah, it is kind of like, I mean, that is particularly what fantasy is, but it's sort of the taking inspiration from historic, the personification of the wind as well. The fact that it was called, what was it that they called it? You can go back to it. A seeking wind, the Getlanders called it. So this weather isn't unusual.
No, they have names for the different types of wind. That tells us a lot about their culture.
Yeah. Like how in England we have loads of different terms for rain.
Right, or that. I think it's actually not true, but it's this thing like Inuit cultures have 50 words for snow or something like that. I think that's actually misleading, but in any case, you get the idea behind that, right? That cultures that are more familiar with something, they have a better sense of the nuance of that specific element of the world. Okay, so we are approaching the end of this one. I would recommend changing from like what we just did, the kind of craning down. I hope that made sense what I'm referring to in terms of floating. Because we don't always start in a scene. We're not always in a scene in a book. Sometimes we're connecting to the next scene. And that this whole thing of like we drift down from more broad to more specific and more general until we finally land on the root in her fingers. And then we find ourselves in the middle of that scene. It's just a nice way to kind of go from broad to specific and concrete story details and create this sense of movement and forward momentum, like binoculars or a telescope finding an interesting subject. So you can use this to give us just enough setup, then focus in on an interesting subject, stage the scene, then set it in motion. Okay, because we have 20 minutes, I think I've gone over some of the basics. I just want to check these slides to make sure there's nothing else essential that we've missed. I think some of these might be your slides as well, Becky, so feel free to speak up if there's anything we haven't exactly talked about yet. We talked about chapter length. here's some popular books with no chapters. That's just for your information. Terry Pratchett often will have no chapters in his books. Usually I do recommend having them, though. They make your novel a lot more reader-friendly. People typically won't read a whole book in one sitting, and this just gives them a really nice... It has that kind of addictive, just one more M&M kind of quality to them writing. Okay, Becky, anything you want to add before we go to Open Lab today? Do you want to talk about chapter titles?
Yeah, I can talk about that. So, chapter titles, all genres can use them, but there are some where it's far more common. So a lot of middle grade have them, although not all. And comedy, romance can have them. But chapter titles are... They have a purpose within the storytelling. They're not just, if you don't want to do chapter titles, you don't have to, even if you're writing middle grade. But the purpose is to give some information. So if, for example, you're going to be writing a dark scene and you're writing for middle grade and you want the middle grade reader to be prepared for it, you might title it something like... the day my sister disappeared, or something like that, so that they're prepared for the shock that's going to come. It can also be used to make promises. So the example here is in Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. The title was "I accidentally vaporized my pre-algebra teacher," and that tells you this is going to be absurd, this is going to be fun, tells us the age of the kid. And it can also be used to intrigue readers. So The Boy Who Lived, for the Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, that's the first chapter. And it's intriguing. Don't all boys live? Why is it the boy who lived? What makes this boy special? So those are the kind of tools you can use when doing chapter titles.
Can I also add on The Boy Who Lived, because I do coming of age fantasy. Because when you do coming of age fantasy, and actually all epic fantasy in general, it's a lot of respect from your peers too. So when you have a title, that means other people call you this. That means it's a form of respect. And so when read these titles things, they seem like useless, but titles are actually super important in progression. Your title gets longer and longer and longer, and you get more of it. It's kind of like Xbox badges, It's one of the butter fantasies of young men and women. I'm not sure about young women, but young men, anyways.
Okay, so you're talking about the idea of the character gaining different recognition or titles as they advance through the story.
Yeah, The Boy Who Lived is just a title, to be honest. In fact, she should have included more. The Boy Who Lived and Beat Him Again, just add it up,
Right, I guess it helps if they're kind of short and snappy when you're coming up with quick little descriptors like that. Thank you for those comments. Did you wrap up, Becky? Anything else?
I was going to say, so one of the things about titles in middle grade is that if a kid reads through the titles, because usually you have the front page as a list of the chapters with their titles in, it can give them an idea without spoiling the story, so they can see if it's a story that's for them or if it's got darker themes based on the titles. But also, it can have a second meaning. So when you read it the first time and then you reread it, or you go back to the titles and you're like, oh, that makes sense now. And then it can kind of act as a map for your rereads, for your navigation. So it gives that kind of reread value, which kids particularly love.
Yeah.
They'll often reread this book multiple times. I love doing chapter titles.
I love them too.
But it is...
Go ahead.
It is an art in itself.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people I know that don't do them. And I would argue that if you if it's something you want to do, learn how to do them properly. But if you're just putting him in there to have chapter titles, don't bother, because it can actually ruin a story to have bad chapter titles, because you can reveal stuff that you didn't want to reveal too early, or things like that. But I love them personally.
And you were talking about the idea of chapter titles being used to contextualize or recontextualize the chapter, because at first it can seem like it's referring to one thing. You have a title called like The Killer or something, right? And then you reveal by the end, oh, the killer was somebody else that we didn't think it was going to be. So then it actually makes more sense, like after you recontextualize using that title. I think they're great too. My favorite writer of chapter titles is Victor Hugo, and he's a very famous writer of many literary classics, and his titles are so like, I wish I could find just a directory of the chapters in just this one book, but it is they do such, they're so artful in and of themselves. I'll bring it up once I can, but Toilers of the Sea has my favorite chapter titles. Okay, but just for the purpose of time, we're down to our last 15, so let's move ahead to Open Lab, and we're talking whatever questions or problems you're having with your logline or outline of your book. Ideally something linked to chapters and scenes, but even if not, whatever you'd like to ask, we'll open it up now.
Hello. So, I have a question about music. This is not directly like with outlines or anything, but you said that I could ask anything really if I heard you. So, it, I'm trying to think of my question exactly. I had a question before I hopped on here, and I got on here, and so with music and stuff like that, how do they conduct these soundtracks and tie with like the movie? Oh, fuck, that sounds so fucking retarded.
How do they conduct the soundtrack? As in you mean the composer in the actual recording room, or are you talking about how much does the writer influence the soundtrack?
Yeah.
Okay, good question. So we are in novel bootcamp, but I'll take the question just because it's a good question about screenwriting. So in terms of the music on the page, it's usually all we can really do is communicate the scene and the emotion of the scene, and we don't really, the writers are not usually in charge of the soundtrack for a feature film. There might be moments within your story where it makes sense that a certain song plays, like the characters reference a certain song and then it plays, or something like that. And in those cases, it can make more sense for you to include a note in the script that says, this song now plays. But then again, you can never really guarantee that you're going to get a licensed song if it's a particularly licensed one. So it's best usually to have an idea of like a song that's kind of like Bad Romance by Lady Gaga plays, or something like that, just to give them a little bit of wiggle room if they can't clear it. In terms of the soundtrack itself, though, you can call out what you want to have in a scene, but usually it just gets in the way, so it's best not to. I would say only in extreme cases where you're like, this is a murder scene or whatever, a scary scene where the murderer is attacking someone, there's no music in the whole sequence. You could write something like that in because that's particularly noteworthy, and otherwise the director probably would have scary music in the scary scene. So you can like make kind of big choices like that, but the director at the end of the day might decide to do it differently. So it's usually just not within our toolbox or things that we're expected to really be thinking about too much. Just look for those really specific moments where you want the song that you've chosen to have some sort of really clear story effect, or to be a callback to something, or you have some like clever reason for calling it out. But in 90% of the cases, don't worry about music when you're writing a script.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks for the question. What other questions have you guys got about logline, outline, or anything related to writing books or movies or shows?
Completely like random, but obviously if I'm going with this phone charm for this girl, for her greatest sister to be attached, is it alright that I mention everyday objects like iPhone?
That's a good question. I think you would have to kind of make the choice. Is this going to be the kind of book where I mention brands and existing specific real world companies and items and stuff? Or is it not that kind of book? I think generally just due to the fact that popularity for things changes over time. In 20 years, if people aren't still using iPhones, would the book still make sense? Questions like that are just kind of the basic ones you want to ask. And I would say if you're on the fence about it, to lean away from it. So if you would just say her smartphone or something like that, because I think unless we are going to be embedding phones in our bodies in a couple years, then we're going to have smartphones for a while, and you don't have to worry about someone not knowing what you mean or suddenly. I mean, I don't ever really feel like it's that big a problem if a story feels dated. Like, I would never read a story that was written in the 1920s and be like, oh, I can't read this. They're referencing, World War I. That's crazy. Why would they do, like, I can't read a dated story. It's like, that's ridiculous. Of course you do. Of course you can. It's fine to have a story that's dated. They take place at a certain point in time, and time passes and things like that. So it's not a huge deal overall, but I would say if you're half and half, then just go with the slightly more generic version. I wouldn't go all the way as to saying she's using her Me phone, because that just gets a little silly when we're like, what if I make up a slightly different thing?
That suits some things, like in iCarly, where they had their pair phones, and it was obviously taking the mickey, like it was part of the show. But she's in the real world, and all this stuff is happening in the real world. It's just people can't see it. So,
yeah, I would just go with something just 5% more genericized than the actual brand.
Yeah.
So go with smartphone or just phone.
Yeah, I mean, then the problem comes with like tablet. Do I call it tablet or an iPad or?
I think tablet's fine.
Yeah.
I think we know what. I think we've been saying tablet even before we had tablets. Like, maybe I'm not 100% on that, but or maybe they were called data pads or something like that before that point.
They were called Palm Pilots.
Palm Pilots, right?
Palm Pilots. I remember Palm Pilots.
In Star Wars, they had data pads for a long time, and I think in Star Trek they had something similar as well. I can't remember the name. Anyway, so yeah, not the biggest deal in the world. I would lean away from it if you have the choice, though. Thank you for the good question. Luke says in Czech they're just called pads with 2 Ds. Yeah, they also had to, when they got their mail from the ship's customs officer, they handed out tablets to everybody instead of everybody having their own one that they downloaded it to. That was the next generation, at least. Okay, other questions or issues you're having with your story that you'd like to have some opinions on? Mario's telling us that Dragon Ball Z titles look a lot like the titles of Friends episodes, in which Piccolo saves Gohan from certain death by taking the blast to his face. Yeah, it's kind of like the one where they move the couch.
Yeah, it gets really long. It's like the whole story almost.
Light novels are like that as well, with just the titles of the whole book would be like, The Time I Got Reincarnated. I think there's a famous one called The Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime.
There's a parody where it's like 3 paragraphs long. It's pretty popular. But the reason why these chapter titles are like that is because they use it to develop their chapter, right? They write down the kind of like the log line, right? And they put that as the chapter title, and then they don't have time to change it.
Yeah, I guess the title is basically just the log line then at a certain point. It sort of spells out exactly what happens. Other questions?
To add to that, the book, The Loop, which is published by Chicken House, their chapter titles are the days of, to set in it's very dark YA. There it is, the black couple with the it's set in a prison. It's upper YA, but a boy is a teenager is on death row in a prison, and the chapter titles are done as so many days since arriving at the loop, and then when he gets out, it's like so many days outside the loop. Each chapter has a title, which adds to the monotony because at the beginning, when he goes through his schedule, like what he does, there's then chapters that just says and again and again and again, and it's literally titled like the next, the day whatever in the loop, and each, just two words going and again, and it just emphasizes that monotony. So I thought that was quite clever.
Yeah, that's a good way of doing it. And also, it's sort of the way you would pass time in a prison is keeping track of I've been here for 500 days or whatever it is. So it kind of matches. It brings us into it's like the character is the one naming the chapters almost.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. Go ahead.
Luke had a really good question about like what are your worst and favorite like your worst openings, like the worst book of openings that you don't like. It's he wrote in 1:53 p.m. Oh, you don't have the time, but something about data advice. Any book openings you really like or dislike? Open question for the room as well. But like, what's the book opening that you really, really, really irks your ire?
Book openings that I really dislike. Character waking up and going about their daily routine.
Yeah,
Character
I hate that
describing themselves. Character looking. That's usually going to be they look into a mirror, or another big cliche is the character looking at a photograph in the first chapter, or starting by describing a photograph. That's actually something I've seen a lot as well. That feels very. It's like it feels like. Go ahead.
As I say, the looking into the mirror one reminded me that I know what my worst one is. It's it came out after Hunger Games. It had some movies with it. Divergent.
Yeah, Divergent is awful.
That great concept, poorly executed.
The movie is so bad. They're awful.
I think the common thread is that anytime that I can see through your objective as a reader, like I know you as a writer want me to know this, and if you don't cheat and fool me properly, if you're so obvious, then I want to beat you with a stick.
Oh,
that's probably no. Well, I'm just being exaggeration, but like I really hate it when it's so like, oh, you just want me to know that your name is Maggie and that you're pretty and that you have red hair, and you're just gonna just put a mirror in front of you as your first scene just to set it up. There are 1,000 ways for you to do this.
Right.
Don't be lazy.
When it feels like the hand of the author is too evident and we can see what they're doing and see the moves they're making and watching things fall into place because we're like, of course it has to go that way, then the whole thing starts feeling inorganic and like we are reading a story rather than living in that story. We have a couple minutes left. Any last questions or topics you guys would like to ask about? We also do have lab later today. Excuse me, from 4 to 6. Go ahead.
Extract from 50 Shades of Grey. I scowl with frustration at myself in the mirror. Damn my hair. It just won't behave.
Damn my brown chestnut hair and my 5'8" frame. Like, you see a lot of that kind of stuff. He stared into my crystal blue eyes. Like that sort of, it's really common in YA, I guess. And also possibly because agents will sometimes tell you, no, teen readers like that. They want to picture all the characters. You need to give them a little more. And so I think you see some authors going too far with it and over-describing the characters or feeling kind of like you're casting the character rather than describing them organically. Although the one thing I will say people get really weird about in books is race. Whereas in screenwriting, it's almost like it's not that it's super easy and people do have differences of opinion on it, but it's not that weird in a script to say 53 years old, Hispanic. You know what I mean? Whereas in a books, people are like, no, you can't do that. You have to let the reader kind of like imagine the race as they see fit and be really, really vague about it. And I don't really buy into that. I'm kind of weirded out by how people get like so touchy about it. Go ahead.
Editors go the other way. They say you've got to be specific, but you got to be specific about all kinds. If you're going to go down the mentioning the person's race or their skin color or whatever, you got to do it for the white characters as well as the characters that have other skin colors. So, because I was told that by not, this is the other side of that coin, because I was told by not mentioning their color of their skin or their race or anything like that, people are going to assume that they're white American.
Yeah, it is the potential that can happen. And in movies, you might imagine, okay, they're going to cast it as white default if I don't specify. So, therefore, I think it's not that big a deal to. Well, you can just have racially blind cast or racially blind books if you want to, and then the reader imagines whatever they want, and that can work for certain stories. Obviously, it won't work for certain other stories, especially historicals, where the differences between race and class and things like that are really key for understanding what's going on. In which case, you probably have to be a little more specific. If it is a little bit more generic and it doesn't really matter that much, you can leave it out. I just think, in general, people are too reluctant to just say someone's race. I don't think it's offensive to just say a character's race.
No, I don't either. There is a... Can I recommend a really good website, though, for descriptions? Because obviously it isn't something that you get so much in screenplays, because in screenplays you're very literal. There's a website called Writing with Colour, colour spelt the American way. And it's really good because it does tell you, like they'll say, just say their race. But it also tells you some things that are offensive. So as an example, referring to people's skin as being linked to food.
Food, yeah, that one
is quite offensive. So it's very useful. And I learned a lot because one of my characters is a black girl. And I learned a lot about how to describe her hair and the proper way to describe her hair.
Yeah.
So it's really, really useful website.
Right. Writing with Color, I've heard of that one too. And so yeah, if you're not sure, do the research, double check, read some books by authors of that race just to see how they describe characters, how do they describe themselves, things that they pay attention to. And so, like, obviously you want to do the work, but yeah, you don't have to worry too much. Like, oh, am I allowed to say a character is a certain race? It's like, yes, you can. Okay, we do have to wrap up. We're at the end of our time for today. Hope this was a useful discussion of scenes and chapters, and thank you for reading along and doing the exercises with me. We have one more in this series. So next week we're doing finalizing your outline, and you're going to take us through the story. I didn't make anyone do it today just for time, but next week you will try to summarize your story in about 3 to maybe 5 minutes at the absolute most. Focus on the central protagonist. You'll take us through the entire thing, and simplify, focus, hop over detours. You'll feel like you're losing valuable stuff, but it really sets you free. So next week you'll take us through your entire plotline, and you'll get feedback on that. And then we're starting Novel Bootcamp after that, which means that we'll start with week 0, we go into week 1, and then we'll be off to the races with our 90-day novel course. I'll leave you with the things that are coming up. In 2 hours on Script Camp, we do have lab, and over the next couple weeks, we have more free classes that we mentioned at the beginning. Victory Lap, so the fun third act tricks on the 31st, pilots starting on the 7th, features starting on the 14th, novels starting on the 8th. Thanks a lot, guys. If you're a member, I might see you at lab at 4 today, but if not, have a great rest of your week.